On a personal note, I'm very enthusiastic about this. This is unofficially, I guess, the second log affiliated event, and we're very excited for the talk tonight. And it's a pleasure to see the evolution of this, which has some roots both in the last decade of interest amongst our students in graduate architecture here at Pratt, as well as in the course that Gokhan and Sanford have been teaching. So with that, I'm going to invite Cynthia Davidson to take over the mantle and run this evening's event. It's nice to see all of you here. Please enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. I assume you're from various corners of the world, so I don't want to say good morning or good evening. On Zoom, we never know what time it is where anybody is watching from. I want to thank David for allowing LOG to use the Pratt Zoom. In other words, LOG is now having its first Brooklyn event. All of our events for launching issues of LOG have occurred in Manhattan. So it's good to be in Brooklyn, David. Thank you. We need LOG to get out into the 5 boroughs a bit more often, even if we're doing it remotely tonight. It's true, I teach at Pratt, as does Sanford, and as has Gokhan. And so we do have some relationship with that institution. So by way of background in terms of LOG, I want to say a few words about how we got here. Years ago, in LOG 8, we did a special issue called A Critique of Sustainability, which was essentially a critique of the so-called, what I thought of as the easy fix for climate change that was occurring through LEEDs ratings or greenwashing, these kinds of actions that were de rigueur in 2006 when we did LOG 8. Random pieces on the environment have occurred since LOG 8. In LOG 12, for example, Denise Bratton did an interview with the landscape architect Gilles Clément on his manifesto for a third landscape, which is partially produced in LOG 49 as well. And in LOG 19, for example, Ross Adams did a piece on biodomes called Approaching the End, Eden and the Catastrophe, which you can tell from that title wasn't very promising about living successfully in a biodome the way we live today in the environment. A couple of years ago, we at LOG began talking about how could we do a thematic issue on the state of the environment today and the state of climate change and architecture's relationship to climate change. We wanted to find a guest editor who would lead a sort of new investigation about what that would be, which led us to Elisa Iturbi, a young architect, theorist, and teacher who I had met, and who then conceived of the theme Overcoming Carbon Form, which was the thesis of LOG 47. That issue acknowledges the difficulty of changing how we think, design, finance, and live in the built environment, and the need to confront and overcome these habits of dwelling. LOG 49, the issue that we are celebrating this evening, which is the summer issue, has a special section, as most of you know, called The Return of Nature, which was guest edited by Sanford Kwinter and Gokhan Kodalak. It is unrelated to the proposals and the work in LOG 47, but in my mind, it is a first step in recognizing philosophical precedents, shall we say, for thinking about nature, and it becomes an essential underpinning for the kinds of confrontations that Elisa Iturbi has called for. The return of nature is the kind of deep thinking that we intend to continue to publish as part of a plan to resituate LOG as less of an observer of architecture in the contemporary city, which has been its subtitle since its first issue in 2003, and more of an activist publication. As I said earlier this year, actually at an event at Pratt a week before COVID shut down all schools in New York, the time for observation is over. Now we must be concerned with action. So that we might get on with this evening's action, something that Sanford has told me will be a cosmopolitan cultural event, I would like to introduce our panel, which I will do so chronologically related to the length of time of which I have known each of them. So first, Sanford Kwinter. When I first met Sanford Kwinter in 1990, it was summer, and he was dressed unforgettably in a white suit, as if he were Tom Wolfe, the author of From Bauhaus to Our House and Bonfire of the Vanities, among other books. We were on Prince Street in Soho. Sanford is a writer, editor, teacher, philosopher, critic, husband, father, and friend. He's taught at Rice and Harvard and is now on the Pratt faculty. In addition to his work with Bruce Mao on Zone and with Zone Books, he has 2 books of his own, Far from Equilibrium, a collection of essays based mostly on his work that we did together in the 1990s on Any Magazine, and a book that I edited with Sanford, and a little book called Requiem for a City. And the word requiem there might be an indicator as to where Sanford's thinking is today. Second is Gokhan Kodalak. I first met Gokhan last year when I started teaching at Pratt, where he was co-teaching seminars with Sanford. Gokhan is part of a younger generation of architects whose work on the environment is becoming increasingly important. He received his PhD from Cornell earlier this year, where he wrote a dissertation called Spinoza and Architecture, which was supported by a number of important fellowship grants. Work from the dissertation is in log 49, but what particularly strikes me about Gokhan's piece in log is its slow build to an almost manifesto for architecture and the environment, moving from history and analysis to an urging to act. Gokhan is an architect with an office in Istanbul, a theorist, a teacher, and also a dad with an eye on the future for his child. And finally, Erin Manning, who I just met 30 minutes ago, unless you count the editing emails we exchanged this summer as a kind of acquaintance. Erin is director of the interdisciplinary PhD in the humanities in the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia University in Montreal. She's on the good side of the border. She is a professor of philosophy and cinema, as well as a cultural theorist, artist, dancer, and research creation practitioner. The central concern of her work is sentience or sense, not simply as the sensation of receiving stimulus, but as action, sculpting or shaping life both within and external to the body. Erin is a person of action. She's presently on sabbatical, so I'm really pleased she joined us today. And she was telling us earlier that she's learning to weave during her sabbatical. Somehow, Erin also manages to sit down and write books, including The Politics of Touch, The Perfect Mango, and Thought in the Act, Passages in the Ecology of Experience, which she co-wrote with her partner, the philosopher Brian Masumi. Now, funnily enough, if I counted Brian as knowing someone a long time, I could have introduced Erin second, as I collaborated with Brian in the 1990s. So this evening's program will be a brief presentation by each of these participants in log 49. And then I will cajole them into a dialogue before opening up the conversation to all of you to ask questions. I will ask, because of the number of you, that you please pose your questions in the chat so that I can then either call on you to ask them directly to the speakers or read the questions to them. So with that, I call on you, Sanford, to
If
take
you
on.
just get feedback whether or not she did or not, I mean, it's fine, because they did sort of give it to us a little late.
Somebody has a microphone on. I would ask you all to have your microphones turned off so that we can first hear from Sanford Kwinter. Go ahead, Sanford.
Hey there. Okay. Hi. Listen, I clearly have not got my lighting together properly, but well, you know, listening is what we'll focus on today. First off, I'd like to say that what we're talking about today, and I speak alone, but possibly not completely alone, is intended. I mean, it is a campaign. I wouldn't hide that. It is a project. In that sense, it's rough, it's urgent, it's in your face, and it's intended to be that way. There's a boulder that has to get set into motion, and as everyone knows, that first bit of motion is so much more difficult and requires so much more energetic input to get it going, and so much easier after that, which I have to say is my first tacit apologia for the, shall we say, unusual difficulty of what it is we're here to elaborate on. Secondly, I would like to say how gratifying it is that listening to Cynthia and how she put together a tacit, shall we say, announcement, and that is of LOG's self-conscious intention to address a larger reality now and in the future. The evocation of a issue 47, a 49, and then in a 51 to come, that's a pretty tight concentration of forms of address around this problem that we're here to, in a way, discuss and develop a little bit today. The last thing I'd like to say before I go to some of the notes I made earlier in an attempt, which I never really succeed at, to introduce what this is all about. So, you know, I just do it again and again, and I hope perhaps in my laziness that over time there'll be an accumulation of this type of explanation, and it will start to make sense to others and not only to myself. But I would like to say that I encouraged everyone to engage a kind of dialogical engagement today, which is to say, pay no real concern to integrating your ideas, one another's ideas, rather to present a kind of a spray of approaches as a way of demonstrating, if I can say that, a way of demonstrating that there is a vast and rolling project of concern that's being addressed. And it's really a bit of a job of the editors, of the cultural producers, in a way to bring them together and to constitute them as a kind of a harmonic project. The surface agreements don't matter. The surface disagreements are very, very rich and need to be encouraged. That's it. So what I do there also is I absolve my collaborators, all three of them, from full participation in the claims and provocations that I scribbled out today in order to make. So I see today's event, insofar as it is attended at all, and I hear it's well attended already, and I'm very grateful for that, and very, shall we say, amused, and I feel optimistic about it, though I also realize you probably came to find out what the hell this is all about. I consider it to be an opportunity to provide the type of direct explanation that we couldn't provide in the tight space that we were allotted in the log 49 in the journal. So if I may, let me begin with some very general remarks. The first, and that I'm going to play the straight guy. I'm going to play the straight man. I'm going to hope that the others really pursue, in many ways, their own lines. My contribution to the project, that's to say in terms of my long, in terms of a sustained essay, will follow in issue 51. In that sense, I didn't participate so much as an author, but only as an introducer in these texts. So the first point, the first general remark is that the section, The Return of Nature, from its title to its editorials to its set of esoteric references, was intended to provoke. If you feel provoked, it's normal, it's natural, it's what we wanted. We still do not know, however, if that function was achieved. But like I said, the provocation is a necessary part of getting an inert boulder moving again. You need a bit of an explosion to get this thing going, because it has suffered from what Hume called, or we, the entire field, has suffered from, what did he call it? He called it a dogmatic slumber. So the second point I wanted to make is that we acknowledge that bringing material of this difficulty to bear on design, thought, and theory today requires a certain audacity and a certain patience. The loss of 2 generations of bridging to the tradition of design theory requires a serious investment of reparative infrastructure. Intellectual infrastructure is one of the most urgent and thorny ecological problems facing us today. And I wouldn't for a moment separate it from the broader ecological and the more routine ecological understandings that are continually invoked in the approach, if you like, the intellectual approach and scientific approach, and even the activistic approach to nature. Simply dumping the materials at the edge of the river does not a crossable bridge make. And I'm aware of the fact that in some ways we dumped some really difficult materials, but I see them as materials. That's what I want to say, is from my point of view, as beautiful as these things are, ever more beautiful when understanding begins to actually grasp them. Nonetheless, they do represent, in my mind, a set of necessary materials for the future of this building that is ours to do. Both are needed, raw materials for sound foundations and structures, as well as deft designs and the labor to execute them. We are aware here that we have provided more than anything a storm of raw materials with only the beginnings of a set of blueprints and examples for the building to be done. What you have before you in log 49, and I say this again, is part 1 of a reboot project to be followed up on in issue 51. I encourage everyone here who is interested in it to read the introductions, because they are meant in a way they are meant to ease the entries. And I say also, expect them in the future. I think it's critical to begin to provide those types of frameworks for very difficult materials. It's part of how difficulty needs, if you like, to be engaged in the world today so averse to it. I, for one, believe that architecture's acute current struggle for relevance depends at once on the relaxation of the rigid boundaries that even its avant-gardists have constructed around it, and on its acknowledgement that it is really a material practice. I know most of you have heard that term, a material practice inseparable from a much larger, more perfect, and indifferent one that surrounds, conditions, and limits it. You can call that thing what you like. It is simply the biggest, most relentless, and absolute thing you can conceive of. In the face of this infinity, we must conceive and invent new ways to account for our own finitude and our own position, shall we say, within it. This is where every philosophy of nature finds its urgency, its contemporaneity, and its relevance. There is no such thing as being after nature. We have always known that nature is indifferent to us. The so-called theorists whose claim to have suddenly grasped this understanding for all of us have provided virtually no insight to the game. Nature is indifferent to us, but for that very reason, it is not different to us. I suspect I part with some of my colleagues tonight in affirming that the foundation of all human hubris lies in the primitive narcissistic belief that human excellence can be worked out to reside solely in the separated framework of its technical and cultural achievements. I invoke one example, that of music. No theory of music, or even its ecstasies of enjoyment, can be explained as a strictly human phenomenon. It can simply not be separated from the resonant organizations present long before us and right at the moment of the ontogenetic conception of each one of us. We still do not know from where music comes, and that is because we do not know how to think it. It does not belong to us. We will not find it because it belongs to the relations that constitute us within that wider, indifferent extensa that we might still, with the Greeks, call nature. Okay, so now I have a couple of pages of introduction, slightly philosophical, but a second introduction of fundamental principles that I think will help illuminate those to come. Everywhere in the philosophy of nature, from Aristotle through Kant and beyond, we find the challenge to reconcile the themes of active and passive, acting and reacting, acting versus being acted upon, in the most efficient and retrograde versions of fixed ontologies that emerge today. There is recourse to a theory of latency, this theory of latency that replaces those general problematics, particularly latencies of unrevealed essence. I think the three of us all agree that we must reject these today as harmful mistakes. We all affirm the following, I believe, about the physical world and all of its parts and components. Everything in physical existence is capable of acting, and in its acting, it manifests what it is. I'm well aware that I've just fallen into a passive locution, using the present tense of the verb to be. I therefore proceed immediately to the following activation. What does it mean to act? It means to enter into interaction with other entities, and in so doing, to form compounds. This, in sum, one could say, is a definition of the relational universe. All action is entering into interaction with other entities and the formation of compounds. Let me underline the substitution I just made. I replaced is, to be, with to form. Wherever the forming of compounds takes place, we find the orchestration of forces that we call nature. And the last point is the conception of physical reality has undergone a century of revision and challenge. There are wonderful, if obscure, meditations and treatments of these within the history of architectural and design theory, relativity, quantum mechanics, systems theory, dynamics, information theory, even now energetics. But only today have the wider concerns of the human senses, of cognition, and their enslavements and freedoms become aspects of potential integration into the current and future design problem. This is a direct outcome of two developments, and I see these two developments as underlying and operating in the background of our project here that we call the Return to Nature. Number one, the 2 to 3 decade development of modern materialist position in which architecture happened to play an arguably leading role. And number two, the explosive rise of new knowledge and models of sentience within neurobiology and elsewhere, which endows living matter with full citizenship in the universe of concern. These are not reversible developments. Thought and practice, we argue, must now catch up. Thank you. I'm done.
Okay, Sanford, thank you. Gokhan, are you up next?
Okay. Well, it's beautiful and surprising to see hundreds of participants on a Friday evening. Greetings all. 3 years ago, I will start with a short background about this project. 3 years ago, Sanford and I initiated what I would call an unorthodox teaching experiment at Pratt, the School of Architecture. The central topic was the question of nature with respect to thinking and design. And from the get-go, we insisted on cultivating each class in the form of a dialogue between us. We combined pre-mediated lectures on complex subjects with, one might say, spontaneous and unscripted discussions. And it was not only between each other, but also and especially with our students. That's why I would like to start with a local salute by thanking our students at Pratt, whose continuous engagement and wonder and nuanced contributions have constituted, I would say, the underlying field of potentials from which we synthesized this special section for Locke's current issue. Now, in the practice of teaching, the professors, and I'm sure some of you would agree with me, like to use fancy terms in defining our pedagogical approaches. So when I initially talked about and identified our co-teaching as an unorthodox experiment in co-teaching, it doesn't really mean anything unless I unpack it in a concise manner, at least in terms of its ingredients and contents. Some years in our co-teaching, we started by addressing the very geological formation of the Earth, which is peculiar for an architectural theory class. We started with the volcanoes and their cooling off and the stratifications and the subsequent emergence of flora and fauna and the emergence of early hominids in Africa, not Homo sapiens, but the early hominids. And for instance, I remember having heated discussions with the students in Sanford on Neanderthal architecture, which you would not be able to find in any history of architecture survey, whether canonical or contemporary or critical. Some other years we delved into explicating philosophies of nature, that design discourses have, for one reason or another, largely avoided, perhaps even suppressed. We deliberately focused on a subterranean trajectory or an underground lineage, if you will, that extends from the likes of Heraclitus of the pre-Socratics, Ibn Arabi or El-Hallaj from the heterodox Islamic tradition, Spinoza, the radical early modern philosopher, to underappreciated 20th century thinkers such as Whitehead and Simondon and Bateson, etc. So these explorations were intervened by diverse classes on, say, the cybernetic architecture of Cedric Price, or Sanford's peculiar interpretation of, if I remember correctly, Bruce Lee's fluid fighting style, Jeet Kune Do, or my spatial reading of David Foster Wallace's overlooked short story called Tennis, Trigonometry, and Tornadoes, if I remember correctly. And in between such sessions, we had the privilege to have invited guests such as Erin, who is here with us today, Muriel Coombs, who lectured on philosophies of Whitehead and Simondon, as well as designers and urbanists like Janie Sabin and Peter Trummer, contributing to subjects of biosynthetic architecture or urban mechanology, etc. So this is the unorthodox co-teaching experiment whose ingredients led to this publication. Now, I started with the rationale of this project, if you will, at the most local level, yet there is perhaps, even more importantly, a planetary urgency to it. Because as we emphasize in our editorial introduction, the world right now is on fire. So forests and jungles are scorching due to global warming and climate change. Streets are aflame owing to untenable social hierarchies and economic inequalities, and the entire globe is ablaze following COVID and the deadly pandemic, which was most likely caused by our careless invasion of wildlife ecosystems of bats and the like. So, we have to acknowledge at the very beginning, as thinkers or designers or historians, or as students, and professors and practitioners, however we define ourselves, that we are the fire starters, or at least the ones that continue to fuel this slow-burning apocalypse of earthly life systems. That is, we are the fire. So we need to cut the bullshit, if you will. We need to take responsibility for our actions and start rethinking our tired discourses and practices, for they have failed epically and monumentally in addressing the question of nature. In this special section of Hours and Log, I wrote an essay on the untapped potentials germinating between Spinoza's philosophy and architecture as an extension of my dissertation at Cornell. Now, Spinoza's philosophy is highly relevant for today, as it provides alternative paths with respect to the question of nature, but also to that of being and thinking, to ethics and aesthetics, and by extension, art and architecture. But in the rest of this short talk, I will limit myself to introducing only a few, of Spinoza's critiques and alternative conceptions concerning the relationship between nature, culture, architecture. I will not go into the other segments. Now, there is a canonical narrative that we have fabricated and maintained up until today, which bifurcates the cosmos into two dimensions, that of nature on one hand and culture on the other. And this ontological rupture, if you will, underlies other related and deep-seated conceptions of ours, like the bifurcation of humans and non-humans, as well as the bifurcation of the built environment, that is architecture, and the natural environment. Now, at first, such bifurcations might seem like innocent categorical distinctions. Well, they aren't. These bifurcations are grounded on hierarchical, conceptions. That is to say, our canonical distinctions of nature and culture are not horizontal, but they are vertical. So the premise of this vertical bifurcation is that culture is superior to nature, and humans are, superior to non-humans. And we have grounded our canonical discourses and practices, especially in the European and Western context, from say Descartes and Kant and Heidegger to Alberti and Le Corbusier and the latest architect, on these anthropocentric hierarchies advocating cultural appropriation for architectural mastery over nature. So we have misconceived ourselves in a sense as transcendent agents and surfing, exploiting, instrumentalizing nature with so-called artificial, architectural, and technical tools and means. Now, Spinoza was the earliest and remains to be the strongest critique of bifurcating nature and culture in the early modern period, for forming a hierarchy between the two, which constituted, nevertheless, and unfortunately, by suppressing Spinoza's critical thinking, the canonical foundations of European modernity and, if you will, Western metaphysics. Now, Spinoza argued that such conceptions arose from a narcissistic misunderstanding of our relationship with nature, for we have misconceived ourselves, as godly figures reigning above and beyond and even against nature. For we have, Spinoza was one of the first modern thinkers, if you will, to warn us that such a conception would lead to ruining nature, and in turn to our own ruin, for we are not transcendent. And Spinoza's special concept comes at this interval that we are immanent to nature, which is a beautiful history, but I don't have time right now to go into the history of causa immanens or immanence. Which means for Spinoza, nature and culture are not separate dimensions. That is, there is no ontological bifurcation in the cosmos, but culture and nature and humans and non-humans are built and natural environments. So, if you will, technical and organic modalities of life rather constitute a substantial continuum. Now, if Spinoza is right, and the sciences of the last few centuries, some of which Sanford mentioned previously, they affirmed Spinoza's insightful thinking, and by that I mean a whole range of discoveries, from theories of complexity and self-organization to, say, the biological common descent in evolution, as well as a new science called abiogenesis, that is the continuity of the living and the non-living. Then, if that's true, then we are indeed ruining ourselves by way of ruining nature, right? For we are not separate, for we are all pulsations, or Spinoza would say modifications, in Latin modificatio. We are all moods of nature, which is a poetic way of putting it. So even positing that we are in nature is redundant from this viewpoint. Spinoza would rather say we are nature, and nature is us. Now, in addition to providing immanence as an alternative to transcendence and substantial continuity as an alternative to bifurcation and separation and absolute distinction, if you will, Spinoza also suggests a peculiar ontological conception that I would like to call heterarchy, as opposed to hierarchy of beings. Now, from the viewpoint of hierarchical ontologies, and I can't go into detail about their history here, the way I did in this text, from their viewpoint, and they have shaped the Western collective imaginary. By that I mean the canonical lineage, again, from Aristotle and Plato to Descartes and Linnaeus in biology, or Kant and Heidegger, and even 21st century scientists like Stephen Hawking, etc. This is the canonical lineage. From their viewpoint, there is a vertical chain of being in the cosmos that distributes agency, and it allocates value, and it determines each being's rank. So gods or humans are depicted at the very top of this vertical chain. Animals are usually deemed inferior and located at a lower level. Then comes, plants that are deemed even more inferior. And finally, as we all know, the so-called non-living things, matter itself, or, the modifications of matter, such as mountains and architectural buildings that are situated at the bottom. Now, the formative effects of such hierarchical conceptions are not limited to small circles of high theory. These are pervasive, paradigmatic structures of thinking and acting that continue to shape our everyday lives and mindsets. We have grounded almost all our dominant legal and political systems, ethical and aesthetic operations, epistemic and intellectual discourses, technical and architectural approaches, our everyday conducts and behaviors, and such hierarchical ontologies, unfortunately. Humans above animals, above plants, above non-living things. I'm sure that's very familiar to all of you. This is not only a ranking system in terms of ontology, in terms of being, but also ethics. We value them in relation to their position in this vertical ladder. So Spinoza's alternative hierarchy means that every being exists as a unique yet horizontal modality of the same ontological continuum. And what do I mean by this? I mean, this is a shocking doctrine that was received not only in Spinoza's time as such, but still today is too radical, too dangerous, if you will. That's why his thinking has been banned and suppressed for centuries. And that's why most of us in fields of design and architecture have never encountered Spinoza's thinking. For it takes away the self-proclaimed legitimacy of elevating ourselves as humans, or as well as cultural and architectural agents above other beings and natural environments. For it means each being, whether human, animal, plant, mountain, lake, or architectural building, shares the same ontological continuity. This means there are no ontological monarchs. There are no castes of being. Nothing is privileged or elevated by nature, by essence. Nothing has more intrinsic being or value. And such a hierarchical vision acknowledges then the unique agency of each and every modality and their equal share in existing, and as Sanford previously said, in acting, in affecting, and making a difference in the world. And from this perspective, this means nothing is inert or passive, inferior or subordinate in this vibrant worldview. In Spinoza's daring words that I very much like to repeat again and again in our classes and in these texts that I write, all individual modalities are alive, he says, and he uses the term Latin animata, animate, albeit in different gradations, in diversis gradibus, different gradations, such a beautiful way of putting it, because in order to have a gradation, you need to have a continuum. So within this continuum of nature and culture, we rise and fall like waves, but none of us have, a fixed superiority or inferiority, but we just, become different. And
Gokhan,
yeah. Okay, I'm coming to you. I will.
You've used up your time. Can you wrap up, please?
Wrapping up. Now, what is at stake for rethinking our relationship with nature from these perspectives? Well, this means if we start conceiving the cosmos through Spinoza's lens, rather than fabricating a universal hierarchy of beings to serve our own self-absorbed interests, we will come to conceive ourselves and live as part of a common planetary, even cosmic ecosystem that grounds all that are distinguished as humans and non-humans, as culture and nature, as cities, forests, and deep oceans on equal footing. This means, we are immanent to and inextricably enmeshed with and continuous with nature. And this also means that every modality is alive, has an intrinsic worth to exist, and bears an immanent, I would say, right to express and develop its unique mode of being. Now, in the fields of design and architecture today, and I will end with this. I'm ending with this, Cynthia.
We can talk about this in the conversation. Let's get Erin the chance to speak. You've way over talked. I'm sorry. I hate to
Okay.
be a tough moderator, but I got to cut you off
Okay.
so we can all talk together afterward. So, Erin, where are you? Can you
Yeah,
come
I'm
to
here.
the stage, please? Thank you.
Yeah, so Gokhan, there's such an overlap between Spinoza and Whitehead that maybe I'll just pretend I'm you and continue and make that connections, and we can go back to discuss in the open forum. Cynthia asked us to speak for 13 minutes because it's Friday the 13th. So I prepared 13 points, but actually I'm only speaking for 10 minutes and 13 seconds. And so we'll make up time, like on the highway with bad traffic. And what I've done here is simply retell the paper that is there for you to read in my own words, because Sanford said we couldn't have any insider language. And I thought I might do a talk on insider language, but I didn't. So 13 points, angular perspective in 13 points. 1, Tommy Orange, quote, "We've been moving for a long time, but the land moves with you like memory. An urban Indian belongs to the city, and cities belong to the earth. Everything here is formed in relation to every other living and non-living thing from the earth. All are relations," end quote. 2, nature not as a place, but as quality of experience that worlds. To be of the land is to let nature world. 3, nature that worlds is not nature as self-contained block of matter, but an indefinite operation that matters. Following Gilles Deleuze, who marks the difference between life and a life, which is to say this particular life and the quality of life that moves through it, a nature signals the necessity to consider nature beyond the simple location of a given sidedness. A nature is nature naturing, nature pulsing through the fissures of existence, nature expressive as the modality through which life pulses. Life here is not reduced to human life, or even to any notion of the animate. Life is the opening up of experience to what exceeds it. Life is the bare agitation, as Brian Masumi would say, of potential. 4, warning us against the lure of simple location, Alfred North Whitehead reminds us of the fallacy of sequestering nature, thereby committing to what he calls misplaced concreteness. Nature, as Tommy Orange underscores, is not there. It is seeping in the here we are becoming. 5, becoming does not happen on a line. There is not one thing, then another, then another. That would lead us back to simple location. Becoming is the fissuring of existence, such that new processes emerge. Matter is how processes become expressive. But matter itself is also a process, folding and creasing and hardening into form. The form force expressed at these interstices of divergence and convergence are what give life to it. They do so by fostering new operations. When architecture composes, it moves with matter's own movement, sensitive to how the force of form of matter's operation opens the way for an amplification of the nature that runs through it. 6, to activate and make felt the mattering in matter, bodying and worlding must become one. That is to say, there is not body and matter, or body and nature. Body is the force of mattering's orientation toward a certain perspective of the universe. This perspective is not that of the bounded individual, as though it were possible to sequester one stable form from the plethora of movements that make experience. When Saidiya Hartman speaks of, quote, the bounded individuality of freedom in the context of slavery, she is reminding us that the figure of the individual supports racial capital. The individual requires the cleaving of nature culture in order to sustain its commitment to superiority, to whiteness. Embodying that nature's is a sociality in the making. Sociality is a force that compels us to recognize the ecological quality of expressive potential. To architect for sociality is to be sensitive to what is already there, already in act. To architect for sociality is to allow the amplification of the living to make itself felt without deciding in advance where it resides. 7. To attune to what is already underway is to shift from a personal perspective to a perspective of the event. This is Whitehead's term for how the world resonates through all contact. This resonating does not occur on the plane of the actual necessarily. In all drops of experience, there is a quality of excess, a more than, that is attuned to and tunes to the wider field of experience. In practice, this means that there is no absolute segregation, though the drops themselves remain absolutely singular. To architect under these circumstances is to foster techniques of attunement to that more than, to how the perspective of the universe is carried in the occasioning of experience. What else is active here? What else moves the bodying? 8. Whitehead calls the mode of angling the world into perspective prehension. By prehension, he means the grasping in the naturing of a potential for realization. This is a roundabout way of saying that perspective is not mine alone, and that perception cannot be reduced to a bounded individual. Freedom, to go back to Hartman, is never found in the individual. It is precisely what exceeds it. Freedom, seen this way, is potential, an opening onto experience uncharted. But uncharted should not here be heard in alignment to capital's appetite for the newest new. This is not about innovation. Uncharted must here be considered in the minor key. Uncharted is angled otherwise. All that moves to expression does so in difference. 9. The web of potentialized relations that make up the world, both actual and virtual, produces time and space. Time and space are not neutral containers for it. That would return us to simple location. Whitehead speaks of the extensive continuum to articulate this quality of activation that gives time and space to experience. To understand the difference is vital to the process of architecting, which too often reorganizes the environment into a passive notion pre-existing space and time. What is it to make felt the coming into expression of space? 10. Whitehead speaks of his philosophy as the critique of pure feeling. Whereas the Kantian revolution moved reason to the forefront, setting up the conditions for the simple location of space and time, Whitehead's aim is to motor experience with feeling. Feeling here must never be reduced to the individual. Feeling is what consolidates a process. A perception is a feeling, not in opposition to its content. It is a feeling in the true sense that its expression fields the world in a singular affecting way, shifting the world's attunement to itself. To consider feeling this way is to understand that the affective can never be put in a binary with the so-called contents of the world. If matter matters, it does so feelingly, affectively. Matter's fielding a form in a singular way is its feeling forth of experience. Feeling is not a state. 11. The temptation to move these concepts into the grander operations of the subject is always with us. My feeling, my space, my built environment, my universe. Something entirely else is at stake in the Whiteheadian cosmology. Here, where feeling motors experience, subjectivity is never mine alone. It is the subjectivity of the event, of the world naturing. All events, Whitehead says, are activities of concern. Concern here has to do with the process of actualization. This process requires care. How an event of experience comes into itself matters. What does it have to exclude to become what it is? What do these exclusions portend for what comes? An activity of backgrounding, foregrounding is always at work here. Some qualities of experience persistently pushing to the foreground, while others pulsate at the edges. Whitehead calls this contrast. All experience is made of contrast. Ethically, what presuppositions move contrast to normopathy? What do modes of perceptual apathy, regularly practiced in the name of neurotypicality and whiteness, persistently exclude from lived experience? This is not to return experience to the individual, but to emphasize that in all of this, techniques matter. Practice is necessary for the lived experience of perspective in the event. 12. In the pulsations of the what else, minor gestures make all the difference. Minor gestures are variations in the concern of the feeling's lure. That is to say, to feel them is to be in the feel, to practice attuning to what exceeds the hardened form of matter's simple location. 13. Difference without separability. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Okay, I'm not sure that we got through this without some insider terminology tonight, but I'm happy so many of you have hung in here through this. Sanford, let's go back to you. I was quite struck by the remarks that you prepared and this call for action or acting. I didn't realize that we would be so on the same page with my opening comments. But Sanford, since you and Gokhan cooked up this whole thing, Sanford, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, we can't see you. You're just an
Oh, why am I not? Oh, so sorry. Somebody criticized my lighting and I felt really shy about it, so I turned off, but it's okay. I'm back.
It's okay. It's all right.
Mhm.
You said that all action is interaction, which of course makes me think about something I don't think I heard Gokhan say this evening when he talked about enmeshment in his piece in Log. And it seems to me too that this also relates to what Erin just was talking about in terms of process and experience made of contrast. For there to be contrast, there has to be more than one element. There has to be some kind of interaction. How are we going to think about interaction differently? Because I don't think it's something that people have forgotten about or discarded when it comes to making architecture. What are you all getting at in this idea of active and passive? All action is interaction, enmeshment. I mean, all these terms could be used to describe architecture as it is today. What is it about how you're framing it now that changes that?
Okay, well, let me just say I will relay your question rather than answer it because I think both Gokhan and Erin though Erin's not used to dealing with architecture, she doesn't necessarily know where the fence posts are and where, what's in bounds, what's out of bounds. But of course, she has created, shall we say, a universe of and a language, a set of concepts and descriptions, but also she's populated the universe of engagement with the physical world with a whole set, if you like, of different modalities. And that is, number one, something that we ought to pay attention to. Let me say that right off. It's also true that it's hard stuff. When she says things like feeling, it's not just the feeling, that you heard about, from your mother. It's a system of generalization in which the universe comes to know itself and distributes its capacities differently, indifferently, but whatever, throughout it. And those are the things we go in our lives to recover. I think that Erin will have her own way of dealing with these things. In a certain sense, what Erin came to us with today, and in some ways, in her piece for nature, she came to us with a song. And as I listened to her song, I couldn't write fast enough because I wanted to capture the phrasings, because in the phrasings I felt there is musical reality, and it's precisely the place where understanding, language, thought, and feeling come together. But I couldn't capture enough of them, but I certainly got a lot of them. So let's at least step back and notice that Erin is most comfortable in her Whiteheadian existence when she is discovering the verb that lies behind every noun, and often brings them in, even when they smell awfully of Heidegger, as in the concept of worlding, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't matter because she's regathered them. That would be thing number one. You spoke about action, I spoke about action, Gokhan spoke about action, and hell, if Erin didn't speak about action, I don't know what she spoke about. But there alone lies a breakthrough of understanding for architecture, because clearly another way of understanding what we gathered in part one of the Return to Nature is ontology, Simondon, Whitehead, Spinoza, and so forth. It is going back, if you like, to the foundations of what is, ultimately to rebuild the pathway of experience. And when I say experience, I mean both thought and feeling, such that we no longer live in the ghettos that were described in his way by Gokhan, in my way by me, and certainly with Erin, who has frankly already escaped the chicken coop. She's already outside of the ghetto. In other words, in her field, she has, which is dance and which is performance and other things. Let's say the walls were not quite as high, and the openness, if you like, to an ontology of movement and of contrast, because all movement is contrast. We know the brain, the senses, the sense organs have no capacity to operate in the absence of contrast. We know that without motion, without movement, nothing is really perceptible. And we know that when the world seems at its stillest, our capacity to grasp it comes only when we move, or in the case when we are stationary, with the capacity for our eyes through saccadic movement, etc., to generate forms of motion which can capture it. So ultimately, what we're all talking about here is how does architecture intend to maintain its relevance as a mode of capturing the future, what matters, and the things that we need to invent, if you like, to get us through the challenges that we are facing. We know that in the background, there's one challenge greater and more unfortunate than any other, and it is the catastrophe of the natural environment, which is well in its way. But the real catastrophe in some ways is our inability to understand, to imagine, to project ourselves as a reparative process to kind of acknowledge or understand the violence that brought us to where we are through the multiple acts of separation, if you like, which came to it, which we underwent. Now, architecture led that charge for the longest time, and it was.
Okay, so then let me ask. I want to throw this to Erin. Okay, since you say she's escaped the ghetto, I want to ask her if that's really true. I mean, okay, dance. Yes, we can dance outside on the ground. We don't need a theater. We don't need a stage, whatever. But have the disciplines that you work in, I mean, cinema needs a projector and a screen and usually a dark space, which unless we're out under the moon, we need a theater, right? Have the disciplines that you particularly work with escaped the ghetto?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that there are different ghettos for sure. I mean, my academic background is actually all in philosophy and political philosophy, and that's a ghetto if there ever was one. But there's something that strikes me that's interesting. Two things quickly, just following up on both of your remarks, that my encounter with architecture was through dance. Maybe almost 2 decades ago, people inviting me into architecture classes to think about movement. And that for me was a really rich encounter to try to understand what kinds of questions architects ask and where they ask their questions. Because I think what we learn from different disciplines is probably that the question comes at a certain point and then the problem closes down at a certain point. And often that point has to do with a certain amount of labor. At what point have we invested so much into the process that it has to close itself down? So that might be interesting, something interesting to talk about, particularly in light of a question that came up here that I read in the chat by Donald Bates, which is a kind of, I have to say, predictable question. So I don't mean that negatively. I just mean that as somebody who is Western and deals with Western philosophy, it's almost inevitable when you work with Whitehead or Spinoza that somebody's going to say, why aren't you working with indigenous knowledge? Or why aren't you working with older philosophy? And I think the answer to that is quite simple, because I'm neither indigenous nor Asian. But what I can say, having written quite extensively about Aboriginal philosophy in Australia, is that one of the richnesses of Whitehead and Spinoza, I think, is the convergence that his philosophy allows to philosophies of like that of Indigenous Australia. And I'll just give you one interesting example, which I think connects completely to what Sanford was saying and what everybody was saying. And that has to do with a practice of Australian art and ritual that has become well known since the 1980s, which is Aboriginal dot painting. And these paintings, if you've never seen them, you can Google them, are literally made of dots and come out of a long, long, long history, at least 50, if not more, 1,000-year-long history of making these drawings earlier in sand. They eventually come to canvas. And what's interesting about these drawings is that they forego any kind of Euclidean perspective. And actually in the paintings, they forego the perspective. So you'll often see people painting these paintings, sitting around them and moving around them. In the more Western engagements with these paintings, there's a desire to have them become representational, for them to organize nature, so to speak, because there's this desire for us to be able to situate Indigenous thinking and practice in these in these painterly explorations. But one particular Aboriginal artist, Emily Ngwari, really spent her whole life, well, her life of painting went from the time she was 80 to 89, where she made something like 4,000 paintings. Every journalist who asked her what she was painting, she responded a whole lot. And she never deviated from that. And I think there's something really important about that response, that if we're going to ask this question of what else nature is if it's not separated from culture, we have to return to the question of what we think we know how to see, or what we think we know how to organize, or what we think we know how to turn into a perspective for us. And so in that sense, I think, Cynthia, I've always been in architecture. How could you not? And yet, of course, I'm not aware of the infighting in the field, though I can surmise that it went anti-theory, that because that's what's happened over the last 20 years everywhere, and that there's been all this talk about practice versus theory that we're trying to break down today, I hope.
We have quite a lot of comments in the chat, and I'd like to ask the individuals who have posted them if they want to enter the discussion or if they want me to read their question. So for Marina Rodriguez das Neves, do you want to talk or do you want me to read your question?
Yeah, I can read my question. Hello, everyone.
Go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for the incredible roundtable. It's absolutely great. And I was wondering, what are the boundaries between natural or the idea of nature and naturalization? There is a conflict, I believe, between the nature as a process that is constantly in change that we were mentioning, and the idea of the concept of naturalization as a dogma. That things that we naturalize. We naturalized mechanization in the past. We're still suffering it. We naturalize binarism. We naturalize the domination over nature. So how can we, and I want to turn the question from the idea of nature to the idea of denaturalization. So how we can denaturalize the mechanistic view of nature that we already have. That's my question.
Who wants to take that? Gokhan, do you want to try to talk about denaturalizing the mechanistic view of nature?
Why not? So as far as I understand, the term naturalization here is used as a way of stabilizing the meaning of things and our conceptions. In other words, when we say something is natural, that something then is by essence and by design what it is, right? So when we talk about the naturalization of binaries or sex or any form of political, let's say, relationships, what we mean by those things is still from the viewpoint of a very impoverished viewpoint of nature. That is to say, that nature itself has fixed and unchanging, structure in which whatever we do, it is in this sense stays the same. Whereas from the viewpoints of what Sanford and Erin and I talked about in philosophies of Spinoza and Whitehead and Simondon. And I think to also go back to the previous question about the indigenous cultures, we also in addition to Erin's work on indigenous culture, we also talked about Islamic philosophies at the very beginning. If you missed it, we also talked about Bruce Lee's Jut Kandu, which is a channeling of Taoism, which is an ancient way of conceiving the cosmos in constant flux. And from these perspectives, when we talk about nature, we are already talking about constant and infinite modification. So in that sense, if we talk about naturalization from these viewpoints, then it would mean something that is always modifying, self-modifying itself, right? but I understand your hesitance. There was even a new book that was called, if I remember correctly, that had it entitled Renaturalization. It's Spinoza, Hassana Sharp, which is a feminist critique. And at the same time, she's trying to channel Spinoza's philosophy with the latest thinking in environmental humanities and feminist thinking. So what I would say is we need to rethink how we conceive and formulate this term that we are using. And naturalization then would mean something very, very different rather than keeping something static. Okay.
Thank you, Gokhan. Questions are coming in here. Don Bates actually has more than one question, and since he's joined us from Melbourne, Don, do you want to pose your other question to Sanford about the Greeks, or shall I read it?
You can read it.
Well, but there you are. Just say it.
It's okay. I've read it. I've read it.
Yeah.
I've read it. I've read it. And look, I have to say this. It's wonderful to hear from you, buddy. I remember our days in London so well. I miss
But
you.
wait, Sanford, if people
Yeah.
haven't read the question, you have to tell them. What
Oh, you're right indeed. You're right indeed.
yeah.
So I don't know which part of it I should read. There are two parts on my screen.
Let's just do the back part. I'll do it. Back to the accusation on the failure of modernity and mastery over nature. Aren't the ancient Greeks, especially from Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, the start of modernity? You looking at the same question?
Yeah, no, I wasn't. But where is?
It's the first question. See, Don, you should have asked.
Okay. Look, I mean, look, I can.
State it simply for the audience. State it
Well,
simply
it's just.
for the
I
audience.
mean, it was just. In your introduction, you talk about. I mean, clearly there's this agenda to position Spinoza as an alternative to other philosophies that we've been dealing with for the last, at least 50, 100, 200 years. But my question is really that you make this statement about going back to the Greeks, to the ancient Greeks, but I'm just trying to posit that, the ancient Greeks are only 2,500 years old. We have other cultures that are much greater, and that in fact, the condemnation of modernity, numerous people suggest that actually modernity starts with the ancient Greeks, that the very formation of classical Greek philosophy is a structuring of the world. It's a process. It's a way of formalizing a relationship to the world, which is the very basis of modernity. So it would seem to me that, and when we talk about Heraclitus as kind of pre-Socratic, then there is this notion that the formulation through aphorism is very different than the kind of structured rational thought that we posit with classical Greece. So my putting forward about indigenous cultures in Australia is to also suggest, I think what's interesting about the indigenous culture in Australia is not that they're more naturalistic or somehow native, they're very interventionist. I mean, Aboriginal culture intervened and has been building the landscape of Australia for 40,000 years. So this is not a return to nature as if there's no intervention. It's a very interventionist culture, but it's a culture that intervenes on a parallelism, not in domination, but in parallel working with it. So I'm just trying to put that as an alternative to always returning to Western European philosophy.
Okay, well, I'm going to have to try to answer this, partly because it's valid, partly because it's so fucking irritating. And it's important because it's the irritation that every academic, in a way, has to deal with. And it is the following. The invocation of the Greeks was done primarily for two reasons. Number one, it was a generic invocation of going back to the beginning. That's number one, whatever that beginning is conceived or construed to be. Secondly, it was because in the context of Spinoza, Whitehead, Simondon, and some of the other philosophers who were invoked therein, that's to say, in the philosophy of nature, the roots of such a thing as anyone who sort of formally approaches the study and the adumbration, shall we say, of philosophy, is that is typically where you go, because those are the roots of thought in Whitehead, Spinoza, as well as in religious thought, et cetera, Spinoza and Simondon, because they're continually evoked in those thinkers themselves. Now, the next thing is this, is that many of us already do work a great deal in, shall we say, pre-modern and non-Western ontologies and philosophies of nature. I have done tons of work in all kinds of areas, including Africa, hunter-gatherers, Japanese, various prehistoric things. My own paper, which is very, very long, is actually on the indigenous cultures of the plant world of the rainforest and the psychic ecology that let's say that it arises in that type of a context, and what it can teach us, what it can reveal to us about a world which we don't really even know how to look for. Having said that, every academic, and here's where the irritating part comes from, every academic is always told, if you like, to expand their horizons, but today more than ever, we're also told you must not appropriate. Honestly, I think of the two, I'm hell-bent on appropriating, and I just wanted to make sure you understood that when I do that, I don't expect you to challenge me for appropriating, that's to say, or anybody else, although I expect it. Now, there is no doubt that this call to an origin is problematic, rich, and something to be engaged and assessed today, if only because the tacit activation of a false understanding of origins has become so harmful, I would argue, within our thought today. So what we do is we look for means and techniques, if you like, for thinking outside of those constraints, tacit and otherwise. To go back also, I'm not going to say this, is that the Greeks are clearly not a monolithic group, a monolithic system of thought. In fact, when one invokes the Greeks as the origins of modernity, you know, you go back to the very, very first recorded thinker, Thales, and this was a famous joke that one told about Ernst Cassirer and his classes at Columbia University about Thales. But the bottom line is that Thales is widely seen by virtually every scholar from Nietzsche to Heidegger, philosophers, and every other. The cliche is simply, he was the first one to make a statement when he said all is water, to make a scientific statement about the world and not a merely mythical statement about it. The suggestion that the world could be understood by assimilating it, if you like, to the affects, to the behaviors, to the expressiveness that we can witness or access in water itself. Now, there is clearly any philosopher, anyone who teaches philosophy, and I often have to teach and enjoy, by the way, teaching the early Greeks, it is actually to bring us closer to the moment where thought and feeling and the material world, that's to say, and experience, we're wrested from one another, but we're still in harmony with one another. And as far as I'm concerned, that is one of the useful destinations that we should work to getting back to. Now, I believe it can be done through a variety of studies, and I agree with you in invoking them, but it's not one or the other. What we need is a general agreement, if you like, to get out of our silos, if you like, and to understand that it's not just about learning new things, it's about thinking differently. And in some ways, and I argued this at length in my book when I talked about radical anamnesis, it was the idea that the past offered us pathways of freeing ourselves of thought. They offered ideas, they offered formations, which we must now actively try to recover and remember as ways out of, if you like, the tyrannies of the present. So, in answer to your question, I never want to answer this question again. But then again, I don't really believe that I'm going to be able myself, or with even the help of my brilliant friends, create a universe where that question will go out the window, because I see it going in the exact opposite direction almost everywhere, particularly in the humanities. The rote, knee-jerk, identitarian desire to immediately accuse every thinker of moving out of the bounds of what they're allowed to think is just astonishing to me. So if you don't mind, I'm going to put you in that category right now and ask you to move out of it.
Okay, good. We have so many questions. We're going to have to start coming up with shorter answers, because
Sorry.
really we're not going to solve.
How about if I just check out right now? Because
No. Victoria Barbo. I don't know, Victoria, do you want to engage your question, or should I just address it to Erin?
I can read it. So thank you everyone for your words. I resonate very deeply with all that has been said. And I apologize for bringing someone else into the mix. Not that we need another thinker, but that's kind of the angle that I've been using to approach some of the matters discussed. So Henri Bergson says that perception is virtual action. So for him, the germ of action is in perception. And I would even go further and say that perception is grounded in sensing and in time. And my question is, I think that's also a question I ask myself, in a world that is more and more filled with noise across different domains and dominated by the visual as a sense that dominates much, how can and do you think it is necessary for design and architecture to contribute opening spaces for sensing, not only seeing, but also listening to the rhythm of life?
Well, if that's not a question for Erin, I don't know what is.
That's what I said. It's for Erin.
All right, I'll just give a quick answer, because I know we're short of time, but I'm always available to continue the conversations. And just a note to everyone that I know that what I read was perhaps hard to hold on to, so I did put it up in the chat. I think your question is really interesting, and there's a lot to say about also all the overlaps in process philosophy, and definitely there's a relationship between Whitehead and Bergson. What I would say quickly is that when Bergson says that perception is a virtual action, he's already attuning us to a problem of the subject. He's already saying, be careful that you don't understand this as your action or your perception. And I think that that's something that I would also say to a couple of the other questions, that if you take this work and then you just turn and say, how do I do it? You sort of miss the process philosophy, because it can't be about you. That's the thing, right? And I understand that that's a problem for architecture. I get that. But as the comment before by Donald Bates, it made it so clear, we have experiences in the world where architecture is not about a person architecting. It's about the world making itself in an ecological collectivity with us. Now, I think you're absolutely right that there is a problem, though, with the question of how we can do that in the world in which we live. I mean, I think that that's the crux, and I think that's the urgency. And I'm not suggesting that it's easy, and that's why I ended with practice. I'm going to give you just one example, because for me, all of this, even though I'm a philosopher, all of this is sort of empty without practice. I work very closely with a deaf-blind poet whose name is John Lee Clark. And I've been working very hard to try to learn how to think about architecture from the perspective of deaf-blind folks. And what I've learned about this is that in order to live in an environment, live well in an environment, if you're deaf-blind, you need a multiplication of affordances, not a reduction of them. So, for example, the door frame is terrible if the door is open. It gives you no information. But a wall is better because at least it gives you the information of a surface. But a soft wall versus a hard wall is even more interesting because it gives you even more information. And in part of my work at the moment is learning to make rugs, in part because I've been interested in how rugs shift the architecture of an environment if you're deafblind. So I'm not an architect, but I understand that if you have a threshold and a rug at the threshold, it gives you the experience of a threshold. So when I said, let's work with the environment that exists, I was really being serious, that the environment gives you information. And so how do we begin is not by entering, I think, with more. It's by really beginning to pull out what is already there. And to think together about what minor gestures can be activated so that the field shifts. And in that shifting, of course, what's happening is feeling is rising to the fore, not my feeling, but the complexity, the affective complexity of the environment. And from there, then something else is possible. So I would just always caution the gesture of pulling ourselves out of our discourse to go and work on something over here and to bring it back. I'm not saying that's what you're doing. I'm just saying that's where Bergson helps me think.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. I'm going to try to summarize a question that I think is best for Gokhan from Orkan Beydaji. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name because it regards hierarchy. Where he's talking about Freud refers to killing the father. Religion was left in favor of human-centric rational logic. So the question is, and that design is inseparable from human-centric rational logic. Can design be thought out of hierarchy and rationale? Maybe it's thought without hierarchy and rationale to free it from the human-centric paradigm.
Can I also elaborate it a little bit more, with also in regards to the return of nature, the topic, the title of Log, and that's Freud's reference is actually putting this in a context where I'm setting a paradigm shift from nature to human-centric. And of course, then after all, since we are all continuing to, our thinking is celebrating is human dominant, and Design Act is actually in hierarchies. And is it because I'm all it's sort of a paradox or a dilemma that I can't get off. Is the Design Act can be thought out from the hierarchy and rationale?
Gokhan, can you follow that? Can you take that up?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right to detect a certain parallel between Abrahamic religions that conceive God as a transcendent entity, and the great chain of being, or the divine hierarchy that is created, which is I think called scala naturae in Latin, which means natural scale, natural hierarchy, and which was, among other theological doctrines, fundamentally laid out by Aquinas and Augustine, etc., in Christian religion, with the human-centric modes of thinking, because theocentrism and humans or anthropocentrism go hand in hand, that is to say. And when Nietzsche talked about killing the God, right, it was still a critique in the sense that when with the paradigm shift of early modernity and the Enlightenment, when theological and theocentric doctrines gave way to anthropocentric doctrines, what changed was not to get rid of the hierarchy, but we just replaced God's seat with our own. We just sat in his own throne, right? And we kept the hierarchy still. We kept the humans, animals, plants, and non-living things, that kind of ontological hierarchy. So in a sense, my answer to your question would be that, of course, and this is one of the one of our ambitious, one might say, pursuits in thinking about this, how to think of architecture from a non-hierarchical viewpoint that does not situate only and primarily humans at the very center of its logic, but thinks about humans in relation to all the other beings. And you can think of these as natural, and ecological relationships, but also other, modes of being, and how to think of becoming one with that kind of logic and create, in my own terms that I use for Spinoza, a hierarchical logic, but you can say a horizontal one. How to think of that? It is very difficult for to keep it short for many reasons, but the primary reason being that we have, to use the term, one of the earlier questions, we have naturalized in the problematic way these hierarchies so much that it seems almost impossible to think outside them, that there are alternatives, that we can really conceive our relationship in symbiotic terms rather than in hegemonic terms, so to speak. I hope we can contribute, if a little bit, to this discourse. It would be perfect.
That for me is the key point of your whole essay, Gokhan, this whole horizontal axis rather than a vertical axis. I have another question here where the questioner asked me to read it. Thank you for the amazing chat and talk. Could you discuss your inclusion of Jenny Sabin's work and essay in your section? Why did you choose her work as what seems to be the, quote, practical realized representative, unquote, of the more difficult theoretical concepts? Who wants to take that? Gokhan? Sanford?
I can, if Sanford will not. Sanford?
It's yours, Gokhan. Oh, that's
Okay.
yours, Gokhan.
Gokhan, go ahead.
I want to first say that we don't see Jenny Sabin's work as representative or a secondary application of any of the theories that are here. Her work is very genuine and singular in its own way. We just saw her as an ally in the sense that she sees the continuity between biology or life sciences and architecture from a very imminent viewpoint. That is to say, she does not start with a bifurcation even between living and non-living things, and thinks of architecture as alive, as animate in a certain sense, not specifically in a Spinoza sense, not specifically in a Whiteheadian or Simondonian sense, but in a sense of her own. And if you read her piece, she also talks about her own background and how she brought together all these different modes of thinking. And I think it is a very valuable piece to show that architecture and biology are much closer to each other than we, usually think of.
I'm gonna have to ask our audience to stop posing questions because I want to try to get through all of these in the next few minutes. We have a question from Gabriela Valdez Rubalcava, which I'm going to suggest we not try to answer because I don't think it's possible. She says, I think to return to nature, you need to stop the bifurcations, Gokhan, and start to act with other entities, Sanford. How can architecture contribute to this interaction? Well, I think that that's sort of the point of this discussion, to get people to think about that question. We're not going to solve that here today. So thank you, Gabriela, for your question. Then Mele Kamolu, and this is another Turkish name, and I'm not good at pronouncing them. My friend Jorgen Jola, I finally learned to pronounce his name. Introduction of Evolutionary Theory by Charles Darwin was a paradigm shift in the philosophy of nature about the way of thinking about nature. What is the possible implication of evolutionary perspective on the return of nature in architecture? Anybody want to take up Darwin's theory of evolution?
We do. All I can say, really, I don't think this is the right time to address that fully because of its generality. Only to say that I could not think personally of a more important so-called game-changing thinker whose work is more deserving of playing the role of founding principle for how we move into the 21st century, which is ultimately, simply to say this, I'm going to say one thing about Darwin, and that is what Darwin showed us is that the what was that word? The forming process had universal capacity and infinite capacity for accessing the logos to invoke that idea. Let me just say this, it's not a complicated idea. It's very clearly explained in the text in Log, if you want to see it, the logos, the Greek idea of this intelligence which lies in nature, which is demonstrable, which is tappable, which is usable, et cetera, et cetera. So I will simply say that, yes, Darwinian thought would be a very central component of what would be included when certain outdated forms of thinking, such as Euclid, perhaps, I don't know what else, et cetera, in architecture, once they were discarded, we may well find that Darwin becomes one of the new models or one of the new foundational principles for understanding the relationship between, let's just say, contrast, information, energy, intelligence, and form. Kind of things that every advanced aspect of architectural technical study seems to be invoking, but very often in a very flat-footed and naive way.
Okay, here's a question from Saul Anton. If movement, perhaps this is for you, Erin, if movement is the ontological reference point in a Spinozan, Whiteheadian, Bergsonian ontology, what is the movement of architecture? What is the action of architecture? It's a question for all of you.
Yeah.
And maybe it has to be our last question.
I want Erin to take that one. That one, Erin's got to have the last word right here and now.
You know, I'm really honored to be part of thinking. Obviously, I'm not an architect, and so I can't say directly to architecture what is the action, but I think the question of how movement plays a role in architecture is really key. And I would direct people there, if you were reading the chat, there's a gorgeous comment at the end from someone called MM about school and how we think modalities of experience from the perspectives that we've brought forth today. It seems to me that the movement of architecture has to be reconceived from the positing of buildings in the world to the question of how we live in the world. And I'm not saying nobody's thought of that. Of course, people have thought of that, but I think it's urgent to begin to set up modes of perception that aren't culture nature modes. And every time we say subject object, we're back into culture nature. Every time we say my building for the world, we're back into culture nature. And so if we begin with movement, we're less apt to fall into that problem. And I suspect what that means is to fail a lot, to not know how to ask the question correctly, to not understand what our value is, to have no clue what a building is, or what what it means to shelter. Perhaps the last thing I would say, because I know we're short on time, is that I've been very influenced by writings around Annie Albers on this. She was, I'm not sure if you know her, from the Bauhaus. And she spoke about what the role of textile in architecture. And she talked about the work of a curtain. And that's always stayed with me, the way a curtain changes a room, not only as, a blocking of light, but also the way it brings movement into the space. How does that small shift in the way that color and light and wind resonate, what does that do to an environment? What happens if we think of the curtain as architecture? So maybe that's one of the ways to start to think about how architecture acts.
Gokhan, Sanford, any closing thoughts?
The question of motion, I don't know where. No, I want it to be a general and summary type thought. I'm going to go back to Erin's comment in relation to Saul's question. At the moment when she says, what will possibly, she says tentatively and shyly and modestly, what will possibly change the game is to start with movement. Now, I would say that's the beginning of the most profound answer, because it is not the it is not the architectural object as currently constituted, currently understood, with its limitations, its fixities, its economic realities. It is not that object which we are here to cure. What we are here to change is the project that architecture is capable of constituting as we move forward into the 21st century. It is the problem of the organization of the human, shall we say, or let's say the living world with the world that is, let's say, traditionally not seen to be living, but which is the physical universe around us. How we reconceive and redesign and reorganize our attitude vis-a-vis that world, what new things we include, which are on the table as we begin to think, to speak, to design, and frankly, to animate that world. How many architects really thought of animation outside of their computers? Or how many of them, let's say you start with the curtain, but you don't start with the curtain itself as a merely moving integer in architecture. You start with the thought of Annie Albers, which identified it as a living entity. That's to say, as something which relates differently to the other things whose natural proclivities are to move, and to understand why motion is the foundation of what even, what is it called? The promenade architecturale. In so many ways, that was the planting of a seed. Let's face it, that wasn't well watered, but which invokes for us a genius's, if I may say, and I think Corbusier was certainly that, a genius's grasp in the latter part of his life of, frankly, dance, which he discovered in Morocco and so on and so forth, of motion as the fact that, all architecture really was a way of securing and organizing motion. So it's not just motion itself. It's something that underlies motion. It's the logos, to use a word which I don't want you to think that this is, it's the intelligence that is the intelligence in us. And it's the intelligence that we engage, if you like, that exists in the material or in the physical world, which was apprehended long before we came to be who we are, and which actually exists as an apprehension that characterizes most of what psychologists refer to as peak experiences and all the other terms that relate to that. So I would have to say, it's a poorly formulated question that we are answering.
Um, There are other great questions here, but I think we have to move towards an adjournment here. And remember that we're moving maybe back toward theory in a way that we haven't. There was a question that I received by an email from a friend that I didn't work into this about that very fact that philosophy and theory have been were dropped because of the fascination with the digital and parametricism and so forth. And is there a way to get back to it? So that we're even talking about movement and how we think, not just action in the field, action with material, action with nature. I think also we have to think about prepositions. There's a lot of work being done on prepositions now, which I clearly came into play with this issue, where it's the return of nature, not the return to nature, or not the return from nature, or whatever. I mean, it's how we're positioning ourselves relative to this whole way of thinking, or this section in log in particular, is also framed by prepositions, shall we say. I want to thank Erin and Gokhan and Sanford for a stimulating evening. I want to thank all of you for joining us from points all over the globe at all times of day and night, and hope that you take some of this with you, even if you take an iota of it. We have recorded this, so if you need to come back to it, we will be posting how to get to this link on the Anyone Corporation /log website. And thank you for being here. Let's change the world. Let's have some action.
Thanks, everyone.